The fire had taken everything from Grace Bishop except her pride, and as she stood in the ash-gray ruin of what had once been her boarding house on the main street of Callow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1881, she made herself a quiet promise that she would not weep in front of a single soul. The town had gathered, of course. They always gathered when something burned, the way crows gathered on a fence rail after a storm, not because they could help, but because catastrophe had a way of drawing the idle and the mournful alike. Sheriff Dale Prout stood at the edge of the smoldering debris with his hat pressed against his chest, his face arranged into the particular expression of a man who was sorry but not sorry enough to do anything useful. The Reverend's wife, Mabel Holt, had brought a basket of bread, and a look of such profound sympathy that Grace wanted to throw the bread straight back at her. The dry goods merchant, old Percy Watts, kept shaking his head and clicking his tongue like a disapproving clock, and more than one woman in calico pressed Grace's hand and murmured that the Lord tested those he loved, which was the sort of thing people said when they had nothing to actually offer. Grace was 26 years old. She had built that boarding house herself, or as near to herself as a woman in Callow Creek could manage in 1881. After her husband Thomas had died of the fever 2 years prior, she had taken the small inheritance he'd left, every dollar of it, and poured it into timber and nails and whitewash until she had something she could run and be proud of. She had 6 rooms, a proper kitchen, and a parlor with 2 oil lamps. She had regulars who paid on time, and she had maintained every inch of that establishment with the ferocity of a woman who understood that her dignity and her livelihood were housed under the same roof. And now that roof was a collapsed skeleton of charred beams lying in a pile of gray ash and blackened brick. The fire had started in the night, the lantern in the back storage room, left burning by her only hired hand, a boy named Eli, who had knocked it over in his haste to chase a rat, and then panicked and run instead of throwing water on the flame. By the time Grace had woken to the smell and the roaring heat, the back half of the building was already gone. She had gotten herself out in her nightgown and bare feet. She had gotten her 2 paying guests out as well as a traveling salesman and a cattleman passing through. She had stood in the dirt street and watched 2 years of her hard life collapse into cinders. She was not going to cry in front of Callow Creek. She had decided that before the fire was even fully out. "Grace," said Mabel Holt, squeezing her hand for the 4th time in 20 minutes, "you are welcome to stay at the parsonage. We have a spare room. It is only small, but we would be glad to have you." "Thank you, Mabel," Grace said, and her voice was steady as iron. "I appreciate the offer." What she did not say was, "I will not be dependent on the charity of this town." What she did not say was, "I will rebuild this before summer." What she did not say was, "I'm more furious than I am sad, and fury is a cleaner fuel than grief." She was cataloging the damage in her head, the structural posts that might have survived, the foundation stones that had surely held, the brick chimney that still stood like a monument at the far end of the lot, when she heard boots on the hard-packed road, heavier and more deliberate than the shuffle of the gathered townsfolk. She did not look up immediately. She was calculating whether the stone foundation could bear new framing if she could get to a lumber supplier in Abilene within the week. "Mrs. Bishop." The voice was deep and unhurried, with the particular quality of a man who did not use words as filler. She looked up. Jasper Townsend was standing at the edge of her ruined property, and he was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at the chimney. His dark eyes moved along the surviving brick with the focused assessment of a man reading a situation rather than mourning it. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of work rather than inherited size, with a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble, and a canvas work coat that had clearly seen honest labor. Grace knew who he was. Everyone in Callow Creek knew Jasper Townsend, the man who had come down from Amarillo 2 years ago and bought the old Hargrove Ranch on the north edge of town, and who kept mostly to himself but showed up reliably when something needed doing. He was not a man who came to socials or lingered at the general store making conversation. He was the kind of man you notice precisely because he did not try to make himself noticed. "Mr. Townsend," Grace said. He finally looked at her, and the absence of pity in his expression was so sudden and so pronounced after 2 hours of drowning in everyone else's sympathetic faces that she felt something shift in her chest, not softness, exactly, but relief. He looked at her the way you looked at a person you considered capable of handling the truth. "That chimney is solid," he said. "Foundation stones look like they held on the east wall. You've got something to build from." Grace blinked. Around her, Mabel Holt made a small noise of mild surprise, as though a man had just said something inappropriate at a funeral. Sheriff Prout shifted his weight. Old Percy Watts stopped clicking his tongue. "I know," Grace said, and because she respected directness when she encountered it, she added, "I was just working out the framing costs." Something passed through Jasper Townsend's eyes, not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile but more significant. "I've got lumber," he said. "Dry pine from last fall, more than I need for the barn extension I've been planning. I can have a wagon here tomorrow morning if you want to start taking stock of what framing you'll need." The people around them went very still, the way a crowd goes still when something unexpected happens that is also obviously the right thing. Grace looked at him for a long moment. She was a woman who had learned to measure offers carefully because most offers from men came with attachments she hadn't asked for and didn't want. But this man had not said "I'm sorry." He had not called her poor dear. He had not pressed her hand and talked about the Lord's testing. He had looked at her foundation and said, "You have something to build from," and then he had offered the single most practical thing she needed. "What would you want for the lumber?" she asked. "Fair price," he said. "We can work out the figure once you know what you need. I'm not in any rush on payment." "I pay my debts, Mr. Townsend," Grace said, and there was a quiet steel in it. "I didn't suggest otherwise," he said simply. That was the moment, though Grace Bishop would not have admitted it to anyone, and probably not even fully to herself for quite some time, that she first paid genuine attention to Jasper Townsend. Not as a neighbor, not as a supplier of needed materials, but as a man. He arrived the next morning before 7, as promised, with a wagon loaded with dry pine lumber, the boards cut clean and stacked in neat rows that spoke of a man who took care of his materials. He had brought 2 of his ranch hands with him, a quiet Mexican man named Rodolfo who wore a broad straw hat and worked with extraordinary efficiency, and a young Texan named Cooper who was cheerful and talked too much and clearly idolized Jasper without quite realizing it. Grace was already on the lot when they arrived, dressed in her practical brown work skirt and sturdy boots, her dark hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat, a notebook in her hand where she had spent the previous evening calculating measurements and making lists. She had spent the night at the parsonage because she had no other immediate option, and she had been awake before dawn drawing plans by lamplight while Mabel Holt slept peacefully in the next room. "You've been measuring," Jasper said, noting the notebook as he climbed down from the wagon. "Since 5 this morning," Grace said. She showed him the pages. The measurements were precise, the drawings clear. She had given herself a proper layout, 6 rooms again, but with a better separation of the kitchen from the main structure, so that if a fire ever started in the cooking area, it would not take the whole building. Jasper studied her plans with the same focused attention he had given the chimney, his finger tracing the lines she had drawn. She noticed his hands large, work-roughened, with a particular steadiness to them that she associated with men who used tools regularly and well. "This is good," he said. "This spacing here," he pointed to the kitchen separation, "that's smart. You want a breezeway between the kitchen and the main structure. If the materials stretch to it," Grace said. "They will," he said, and turned to Rodolfo and Cooper with a stream of clear instructions about where to unload the lumber. They worked through that first day with remarkable coordination. Jasper and Rodolfo handled the heavy framing work, setting new posts into the ground alongside the surviving foundation stones, while Cooper hauled lumber and Grace worked alongside them with a fearlessness that made Cooper blink and Rodolfo smile quietly beneath his hat brim. She drove nails as well as many men and better than some. She had learned because she'd had to learn, because the boarding house had been her project and her pride, and she had never been the kind of woman who stood aside and managed from a distance while others did the physical work. By noon, they had a rough frame for 2 of the 6 rooms and the outline of the breezeway. Mabel Holt appeared at midday with a pot of beans and a pan of cornbread, which Grace accepted with genuine gratitude this time, because she recognized that food was practical help, not pity, and they were all hungry. They sat in the shade of the wagon to eat, and it was here that Grace first heard Jasper Townsend speak more than a sentence at a time. Cooper had asked him something about the cattle drive he'd apparently been on before settling in Callow Creek, and Jasper spoke about it with spare, precise language that painted images without ornamentation. The months on the Kishom Trail, the particular quality of silence on the open range at 3 in the morning when the stars were thick enough to seem solid, the way a herd of 2,000 cattle moved at dawn, rising from the grass like a slow tide. Grace listened without appearing to listen, eating her beans and making notes in her margins. "You drove cattle before you ranched," she said, when there was a natural pause. "For 6 years," he said. "Started when I was 22. Saved enough to buy land." "Is ranching better?" she asked. He considered this with the seriousness he seemed to give everything. "It's different. Trail work is," he paused, searching for the word. "It's constant motion, you're always going somewhere. Ranching is about staying, about building something that lasts." He looked at the frame they'd erected that morning. "I find I prefer it." Grace looked at the frame too. "So do I," she said. In the afternoon, while Rodolfo and Cooper went back for a second load of lumber that Jasper had apparently decided they would need, without making a production of the decision, Grace and Jasper worked alone on the breezeway posts. The conversation came in the natural way conversation does when 2 people are working alongside each other, not forced, but growing out of the rhythm of shared effort. "How long had you been running the boarding house?" he asked, driving a nail with 3 clean strokes. 2 years, she said. "Thomas, my husband, he died in the winter of '79, the fever that went through Callow Creek that year." "I heard about that." He paused. "I'm sorry about your husband." It was the first expression of condolence he had offered, and she noticed that he said it plainly, without the elaborate compassion that made people's sympathy feel like a weight being added to her rather than a hand reaching out. He said it the way you stated a fact you were sorry about, and then he went back to work. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man. He would have approved of the boarding house. He always said I had more organizational talent than anyone he'd ever met, and that I ought to put it to use." She permitted herself a small smile at the memory. "He was right," Jasper said, without looking up from the post. Grace drove her own nail and said nothing, but she felt the warmth of the observation settle somewhere below her sternum. The days began to form a pattern. Jasper was there every morning, sometimes with Rodolfo and Cooper, sometimes with an additional hand he'd brought from the ranch, a steady older man named Walt who was a skilled carpenter and who moved through the framing work with silent competence. The building rose faster than Grace had dared to hope. Callow Creek, to its modest credit, began to contribute once the foundation of the effort was already laid. Men from town showed up to help on weekends, perhaps because Jasper's pragmatic example had made sitting at home feel like a failure of character. The Reverend came and swung a hammer badly, but with great enthusiasm. The blacksmith, Harold Cross, came 2 Saturdays running and proved to be genuinely useful with the iron hardware. Grace noticed that nobody offered Jasper pity either. They offered him lunch and their labor and, increasingly, a kind of respect. He received all of these quietly and without particular acknowledgement, which only seemed to increase the respect. She noticed a great many things about Jasper Townsend over those weeks. She noticed that he was thoughtful about the comfort of the people who worked for him. He made sure Cooper rested in the heat of the afternoon, because the boy worked himself past sensible limits and had poor heat tolerance, and he brought extra water without being asked on the hot days. She noticed that he was funny in a way that was easy to miss, because his humor was dry and came without warning, and was delivered in exactly the same tone he used for everything else. She noticed that he knew the names of an unusual number of plants and birds, and that he noticed things about the natural world, the direction of the wind, the quality of the clouds, with the attentiveness of a man who had spent years outdoors depending on such observations for his livelihood. She noticed that he watched her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. Not with the presumptuous hunger she had learned to recognize from men who thought a widow was fair game for any kind of attention, but with something quieter and more puzzled. As though she was a problem he was working out in the same focused way, he worked out how best to frame a load-bearing wall. 3 weeks after the fire, the main structure of the boarding house was framed and roofed. It was raw and new-smelling and not yet livable, but it stood solid, and it was obviously going to be something. And Grace stood looking at it in the evening light with a feeling that lived somewhere between satisfaction and exhaustion and grief for what had been lost and fierce, clean pride in what was being rebuilt. Jasper was loading the last of the tools onto the wagon behind her. "It's going to be better than the first one," he said. "I know," she said. "I learned from the first one." He stood beside her for a moment, both of them looking at the frame. The evening was cool and smelled of sawdust and spring grass, and the light was the particular golden kind that falls in the Texas hill country in late April when the air is clear. "You never once asked anyone for help," he said. It was not an accusation. It sounded more like an observation he had been sitting with for a while. "I didn't need to ask," Grace said. "You showed up." He looked at her then, and she looked back at him, and the moment stretched just long enough to mean something before Cooper came around the side of the wagon asking about supper and broke it cleanly in half. But it had been there. They both knew it had been there. The next obstacle arrived in the form of a letter from the Callow Creek Bank, delivered to Grace at the parsonage where she was still living temporarily, and written in the careful language of men who wanted to seem sympathetic while being entirely unhelpful. The bank's president, a man named Aldous Fitch who had small eyes and a large opinion of himself, had written to inform her that the loan she had requested to cover the interior finishing costs of the rebuilt boarding house had been declined. The reason given was that a woman of independent status, meaning a widow without a male cosigner, did not represent sufficient collateral security for the institution. Grace read the letter twice in the early morning quiet of the parsonage kitchen. Then she folded it with great precision and put it in her apron pocket and made herself a cup of coffee and drank it standing at the window, watching the sun come up, thinking. The injustice of it was not surprising. She had known the banking establishment of Callow Creek to be of the conservative and particular kind that viewed women as ancillary to financial matters, as though the fact of operating a business and turning a profit for 2 years counted for nothing against the absence of a husband's name. She had known it was likely, and she had applied anyway because it had been worth the attempt. Now she had to think practically about alternatives. When Jasper arrived that morning and found her quiet in a specific way that she had not been quiet before, a contained, working kind of quiet, he asked, after a short interval, whether something had happened. She showed him the letter. She wasn't sure why she showed him. She had not planned to tell anyone immediately. But something about the way he asked directly, without preamble or the performative concern that people sometimes attach to questions about her welfare, made her take the letter from her pocket and hand it to him. He read it with his usual focus. His jaw tightened slightly at the middle paragraph. "Aldous Fitch," he said, with the precise tone of a man filing a name in a specific unflattering category. "He cited collateral security," Grace said, "which means he didn't want to lend to a woman." "Yes," Jasper said. He did not dress this up. "That's what it means." He handed the letter back to her. "How much do you need for the interior finish?" "Jasper, how much?" he said again, not demanding, just asking the practical question. She told him the figure. It was not enormous by the standards of a working ranch, but it was significant. He nodded. "I can cover that." "No," Grace said immediately, and there was no softness in it. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had expected this answer and was not put off by it. "It would be a loan. Same terms as the lumber, fair price, no rush on the repayment. You pay it back once the house is running and bringing in income." "That is exactly what I told Aldous Fitch it would be," Grace said, "and he declined me." "I'm not Aldous Fitch," Jasper said. "No," Grace agreed, studying him. "But you are a man I've known for a month, and I will not be beholden to a man I've known for a month, regardless of how straightforwardly he makes the offer." "All right," Jasper said, without argument. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets thinking, the way he stood when he was working something out. "Is there any other bank within reach?" "Abilene," Grace said. "There's a larger bank in Abilene that has occasionally lent to women business owners. I've heard of at least one case." "How would you get there?" "I would take the stage." "The stage runs on Thursdays," he said. "That's 4 days, and the round trip takes 2 days." "I know the stage schedule, Mr. Townsend," Grace said, with a small edge that was not unfriendly. He accepted this with a slight inclination of his head that was almost a smile. "Would you allow me to drive you?" "I have business in Abilene. I need to speak to a cattle buyer there, and I've been putting it off. We could make the trip together, and it would get you there faster than the stage." Grace considered this with the carefulness it deserved. There was nothing improper in it on the surface. A man driving a neighbor to a larger town on shared business was ordinary enough frontier practicality. But she was also aware that she was a widow, and he was an unmarried man, and Callow Creek had opinions about such things. "Mabel Holt would have a great deal to say about that arrangement," Grace said. "Mabel Holt isn't building your boarding house," Jasper said. That was so precisely true and so simply stated that Grace almost laughed. She caught the laugh just in time, but not before something of it showed on her face, and she saw Jasper register it with that quiet attention of his. "We would leave early and return by nightfall of the second day," he said. "Yes," Grace said. "All right." They left for Abilene 2 days later at first light in Jasper's buckboard with a good pair of matched bays who moved at a steady trot and made the miles pleasant. The morning was cool and bright, the landscape unrolling around them in that enormous Texas way that always reminded Grace of being very small inside something very large. The mesquite and the cedar and the wide grass flats, the occasional hawk riding the updrafts, the blue distances that seemed to go on past the edge of what the eye could properly account for. They talked for hours. It was different from the conversation on the worksite, longer, more winding, exploring more territory. Grace told him about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 in a farming family, and how she had come to Texas at 19 when she'd married Thomas, who had been a Missouri man making his life on the Texas frontier. She told him about the particular loneliness of the first years of widowhood, not the emotional loneliness, which she had navigated by keeping herself busy, but the practical loneliness of being a woman alone in a world that organized itself around the assumption of husbands and fathers. Jasper listened with the quality of attention that she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, total, unhurried, as though what she was saying was the most relevant thing happening in his immediate world. He told her about his own story, and it came out in pieces over the miles. He had grown up in East Texas, in a small settlement east of Dallas, the son of a Methodist minister who had died when Jasper was 16. He had a younger sister in Dallas who was married to a school teacher and had 3 children. He had left home at 18 because the life available to him there had felt too small, and spent 6 years as a cattle hand before the ranching life had called to him with sufficient force to make him stop and put down roots. "Did you ever regret stopping?" Grace asked. "No," he said. "The moving was necessary for a while, but I was ready to stop." "What made you choose Callow Creek?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. I came through in the winter of '79 when I was scouting land. The people here seemed real, not performing at being something, and the land north of town suited me." He paused. "Also the fire that winter, the fever, you called it. I stayed an extra week and helped with some of the nursing when the town was short-handed, got to know some people, decided I wanted to stay near those people." Grace absorbed this. He had been in Callow Creek during the fever, during the same illness that had taken Thomas. "I didn't know you were here then," she said. "I don't think we met." "We didn't," he said. You had enough on your hands." He had known then, approximately, who she was before the fire at the boarding house, had known something of her situation, and he had not made himself known to her in those 2 intervening years, had simply been a neighbor on the edge of her awareness. She was not sure whether she found this strange or simply characteristic of a man who did not insert himself into other people's lives until there was something genuinely useful he could do. Abilene in the spring of 1880, one was a city compared to Callow Creek, wider streets, more establishments, the bustle of a cattle town with real commercial weight behind it. The bank Grace needed was on the main commercial street, and she went in with her figures and her plans, and her 2 years of documented income from the original boarding house, which she had maintained carefully in a ledger that had survived the fire because she kept it in a metal box under her bed, one of the very few things she had carried out with her that night. The banker in Abilene, a younger man named Harrington, with competent eyes and a manner that was businesslike rather than condescending, reviewed her materials for 20 minutes while Grace sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed. Jasper had gone to his cattle buyer meeting and would meet her back at the hotel in the early afternoon. Harrington asked her several pointed questions about her projected income and her cost structure, which she answered clearly and with the precision of someone who had been running through these numbers for weeks. He reviewed the figures one more time, made a note in the margin, and told her he would need 2 days to complete the review process, but that her application appeared sound, and he did not foresee significant obstacles. Grace walked out of that bank into the Abilene sunlight and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk, breathing. She had not expected the relief to be quite so physical. It moved through her like warm water. Jasper found her at the hotel dining room an hour later. She was having coffee and working in her notebook, and when he came in and read her expression, he sat down across from her and said, "It went well." "He thinks it will be approved," Grace said. "He needs 2 days for the formal review." "Then we wait 2 days," Jasper said simply. "You don't mind?" "My business here will take another day anyway," he said, "and Abilene has a decent hardware supplier. I wanted to look at some equipment." Grace folded her notebook. The afternoon was open, and Abilene was large enough to offer some variety of occupation, and she found, sitting in the pleasant light of the hotel dining room with this man across from her, that she was not in any particular hurry to fill the time with productivity. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "Then let's eat," she said. They spent the afternoon in Abilene in the easy, discovered way of 2 people who find that time together is comfortable rather than effortful. They looked at the hardware. He wanted a new set of cultivating tools, which he explained was for breaking new ground on the ranch's east pasture, and Grace offered opinions with a directness that clearly pleased him. They walked along the main street, and she went into a dry goods store and bought a spool of curtain fabric she had been mentally noting for the rebuilt boarding house rooms. He held the door for her, and she thanked him, and neither of them made anything more of it than it was, but there was a steadiness in the simple courtesy that she noticed. That evening they had supper at the hotel, and the conversation moved into territory that conversations move into when 2 people are away from their usual context and the usual structures are relaxed. He asked her what she had wanted to be as a girl, before the realities of adult life had organized her desires into the shape of what was possible. "A cartographer," she said immediately, and then laughed at his expression. "I was 9 years old and I had just seen an atlas for the first time. I wanted to draw maps. I wanted to be the person who made the world comprehensible. You still do that, he said. Your building plans are maps. You make space comprehensible. Grace looked at him. She was not a woman given to being caught off guard, but this observation caught her off guard, and she felt the back of her throat do something complicated. What did you want to be? She asked. He thought about it. I wanted to own land, he said. From the time I was very young, I wanted ground that was mine, that I had earned. I grew up on a preacher's salary, which means we always lived at the grace of other people's generosity. He said this without bitterness, just plainly. I wanted to be the man who was generous, because he had something solid under his feet. They were quiet for a moment, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind where neither person feels the need to fill the silence because the silence is already saying something. You are that man, Grace said quietly. He looked at her, and this time neither of them looked away quickly. The moment held between them, warm and clear, and Grace was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had not been for a very long time. Not anxiously, not painfully, but with a kind of brightened attention that she recognized distantly as interest of a particular kind. She looked away first, because the evening was getting late and she was still a practical woman, and because she was not sure yet what to do with what she was feeling. But she was aware, clearly and honestly, that something was happening between them that was more than neighborly gratitude and shared worksite efficiency, and she thought he was aware of it too. The next day in Abilene passed with a pleasant mix of separate occupation and shared meals. Jasper finalized his cattle business, and she made additional purchases for the boarding house, and they met in the afternoons and evenings with the ease of people who have established a rhythm. She noticed that he was attentive without being possessive. He noticed when she was tired or when something was frustrating her, and he addressed it practically without making it a commentary on her capacity. When the hardware merchant spoke primarily to Jasper rather than to Grace, despite the fact that the conversation was about something she had asked about, Jasper turned to her and said, "What did you think of the window hardware they had?" As though the merchant's redirection had simply not registered, which was exactly the right move, not confrontational, but redirecting the conversation back to her with a naturalness that made it look easy. On the morning of the third day, Harrington at the bank sent word to the hotel that the loan had been approved. Grace received the note with the same iron composure she brought to most things, thanked the messenger, and then went to the small hotel garden with its sparse plantings and sat on the wooden bench there and allowed herself, for approximately 4 minutes, to feel the full scope of what this meant. The boarding house would be finished. She would pay Jasper Townsend back for the lumber. She would pay the bank on schedule. She would run her own establishment in her own town on her own terms, and nobody would be able to say that she had not done it herself. She was still sitting there when Jasper found her, having apparently been told by the hotel staff where she'd gone. "Good news," he said, reading her face. "Yes," she said. He sat down beside her on the bench without asking whether she minded, and they sat side by side in the thin spring sunshine of Abilene, not touching, not needing to. "Good," he said. They drove back to Callow Creek the next morning, and the countryside was as enormous and beautiful as it had been on the way out, and they talked for hours again, and Grace was aware, with the lucid honesty she tried to bring to herself even when it was inconvenient, that she had not had this particular quality of companionship in a very long time, possibly ever. Thomas had been a good husband and she had loved him sincerely, but he had been a quiet man in a different way, a man who was quiet because the world slightly overwhelmed him, not quiet because he was observing it. Jasper Townsend was quiet because he was paying attention, and the attention he paid Grace was of a quality she had not encountered before, and she did not quite know what to do with it except let it rest in her and see what it became. What she did not do was confuse the situation or romanticize it past its actual state. He had been helpful. He had been kind. He had been honest and decent and more useful to her than anyone else in Callow Creek combined. But being helpful and kind and decent was not the same as declaring an intention. And Grace Bishop had not survived 2 years of widowhood by reading men's feelings as more certain than they were. She told herself this firmly as they drove into Callow Creek in the late afternoon, and the familiar rooflines appeared on the horizon. The work continued through May. The interior walls went up, and Grace made decisions about every room with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted: wider window openings than the original house to let in more light, a proper larder with ventilation, good solid doors with working latches. Rodolfo turned out to be extraordinarily skilled at fine carpentry, and under Grace's direction, he built her a front desk in the parlor that was clean-lined and functional and beautiful in a spare way. Cooper developed a visible admiration for Grace that was entirely innocent and expressed itself primarily in his volunteering for any task that involved working near where she was, which she found amusing and which seemed to cause Jasper a slight, carefully contained irritation that he clearly did not think was visible. It was visible to Grace. She did not mention it, but she filed it away. At the beginning of June, with the boarding house perhaps 3 weeks from completion, something happened that broke the carefully maintained equilibrium of polite, practical neighborly relations. It happened on a Thursday evening, which was Grace's habit of taking supper at the town's small restaurant, Mrs. Whitfield's Place, with its 6 tables and its reliable chicken pie. A habit she had maintained throughout the rebuilding period because it was 1 hour of her week that belonged entirely to herself. She was eating alone and reading the latest edition of the Abilene newspaper when Jasper came in, which was not in itself unusual because the restaurant was the only decent supper option in Callow Creek outside of one's own kitchen. What was unusual was that the only remaining seat was at Grace's table, and that Grace, looking up from her paper, gestured at it without thinking, because to have done otherwise would have been both awkward and unfriendly. He sat down. He ordered. Mrs. Whitfield gave them both a look that contained approximately 3 paragraphs of small-town speculation. They both ignored it. They ate and talked, which by now required no effort. But about halfway through supper, in the middle of a conversation about whether the new telegraph line coming through would change the commercial character of Callow Creek, Grace looked up and found him looking at her in a way that was different from the focused, practical attention she had come to understand as his natural mode. She was a woman who prided herself on precision of language, and the word that came to her was tender. He was looking at her with something tender and contained, as though the tenderness was something he was deciding whether to allow out or keep managed. She set her fork down. "Jasper," she said. "Grace," he said, and the way he said her name, her first name, which he had been using for weeks now as the formal Mrs. Bishop had given way to practical familiarity, had something in it that she recognized. "You should say what you're thinking," she said. "You've been thinking it for weeks, and I'm not the kind of woman who prefers to be kept in suspense." He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she could see him making the decision. "I think about you," he said. "Not just about the building work or the practical things. I think about you, about what you're going to say about something, about what you're going to think of a situation. I think about whether you're sleeping all right and whether the noise of the construction is wearing on you and whether he started again. I have a particular feeling for you, Grace, that is considerably beyond what a man has for a neighbor, and I thought you should know it, not because I expect anything from you, but because I don't intend to pretend otherwise." Grace was quiet for one full breath. "I have known that for a while," she said carefully, "because I pay attention to people. And I have," she chose her words with deliberate precision, "a reciprocal regard for you that I have been trying to assess honestly, because I am not a woman who acts on feelings before I understand them." "That's fair," he said. "It's not a refusal," she said clearly. "It is an honest statement of where I am." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anywhere other than where you are." That right there, that particular quality of patience, that willingness to let things be where they actually were rather than where he wanted them to be, was perhaps the moment Grace Bishop understood that Jasper Townsend was a different kind of man than most of the men she had known. Not because he was perfect or without ordinary human wanting, but because his respect for her reality was not contingent on her reciprocating on his preferred timeline. She picked up her fork and resumed eating. "This is good chicken pie," she said. He smiled. It was the first full, open smile she had seen from him, without any reservation in it, and it changed his face in a way that was almost startling. It made him look younger and warmer and more at ease than she had yet seen him, and something in her chest responded to it with a warmth she no longer tried to pretend she did not feel. "Yes," he agreed, "it is." The boarding house opened on the 1st of July, 1881, and the opening was everything that Grace had worked for it to be. She had 6 rooms, again better rooms, with properly fitted windows and clean whitewashed walls, and a kitchen that was separated from the main structure by the breezeway Jasper had suggested, and a parlor with 4 oil lamps instead of 2, and a proper front desk with Rodolfo's beautiful carpentry work behind it. The town turned out for the opening in a way that was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. Mabel Holt brought flowers. Percy Watts made a speech that was longer than necessary but ultimately sincere. Sheriff Prout brought his hat and his honest congratulations, and seemed genuinely moved by the sight of the rebuilt establishment. Several people remarked on how much better it was than the original, which Grace received as the compliment it was. Jasper came with Rodolfo and Cooper and Walt, and they stood at the back of the modest gathering looking like men who were well pleased with a job done well. Jasper had a glass of the sweet tea Grace had laid out and stood near the window and watched her work the room, shaking hands, answering questions, explaining the new kitchen layout to the women who were curious about the breezeway. And she was aware of his gaze the way she was always aware of it, like a specific quality of warmth in a room. After most of the guests had gone, and Cooper had eaten a remarkable number of small cakes, and Rodolfo had admired his front desk work one final time with quiet satisfaction, Jasper lingered. He waited until they were alone, actually alone. The last of the well-wishers departed, and the summer evening settling around the new building like a warm hand. "It's good, Grace," he said, looking around the parlor. "It is," she agreed. She was tired in a way that was clean and complete, the tiredness of something finished rather than something interrupted. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to important questions. "Yes," she said, I am very happy." He nodded, looking at her. The evening light in the new parlor was gentle, the lamps throwing their soft circles. "I'd like to call on you," he said, formally. "If you'd permit it." Grace was still for a moment, and then she permitted herself the full truth of what she felt, which was a warm, uncomplicated yes that had been building for months. "I would permit it," she said. His expression did not transform dramatically. He was not a man of dramatic expressions, but something in it settled and brightened in a way that was unmistakable, the way the sky looks after a long-threatened rain finally comes. "I'll call on Sunday, then," he said. "I'll be here," Grace said. He tipped his hat and left, and she listened to his boots on the new wooden porch steps, and then the sound of his horse moving away down the road, and stood in her new parlor with its 4 oil lamps, and thought that life could be very strange and very good, sometimes in the same moment. He called on Sunday, as promised, and brought a small bunch of the wild blue bonnets that were still blooming in the fields outside of town, which he carried with the slight self-consciousness of a man who was not accustomed to bringing flowers and had done it anyway. Grace put them in a tin can on the parlor windowsill and made coffee, and they sat in the 2 good chairs she had placed on either side of the front window and talked for 2 hours. And it was different from all the other conversations they had had, not the practical conversation of the worksite, not the easy conversation of the Abilene Road, but something more deliberate and more intentional, 2 people exploring each other's company with the full knowledge that this was what they were doing. She learned, in subsequent Sundays, that he read more than she had guessed. He had a shelf of books at the ranch that leaned toward history and natural science and occasional poetry, which surprised her until she thought about it, and then seemed entirely consistent with who he was. She learned that he had a dry and precise sense of humor that expanded comfortably in private company. She learned that he held opinions firmly, but was genuinely willing to change them in the face of good evidence, which was rarer in a man than it should have been. She learned that he had a deep attachment to the land he had made his own, not as property in a possessive sense, but as a place that had become part of his understanding of himself. She told him things too. She told him about the nights after Thomas died when the house had been too quiet, and she had moved the furniture around at midnight just to make the rooms feel different. She told him about the time she had tried to hire a carpenter to repair the boarding house porch, and he had refused to take direction from her, and she had fired him and done the repair herself, imperfectly, and then done it again until it was right. She told him about Missouri and her father's fields and the smell of soil turning in the spring, and how the wide-open sky of Texas had simultaneously terrified and exhilarated her when she had first arrived. He listened to all of it. He asked questions that showed he had been listening closely. He remembered details she mentioned in passing and brought them back later in ways that said, "I heard you." The summer moved through its long, hot weeks, and the boarding house filled with guests, travelers passing through, salesmen, a pair of ranchers from further south who stayed a week while dealing with a legal matter in Callow Creek, and Grace ran it with the practiced efficiency that she had been refining since the beginning, and it was better than the first one, just as Jasper had said it would be. The kitchen separation worked beautifully. The breezeway kept both the heat and the fire risk at a remove from the main rooms. The guests commented on the comfortable beds and the good cooking, and word spread along the traveling routes in the way that word did. In August, on a Saturday when the town was quieter and the heat had reached a particular brutal peak that made the air shimmer above the road, Grace was closing up the front shutters of the parlor against the afternoon sun when she heard a horse coming hard and fast from the north road. She paused, hand on the shutter, because horses coming hard and fast on a quiet Saturday afternoon usually meant something. It was Cooper, Jasper's ranch hand, and his face was drawn when he pulled up at the boarding house gate. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, "it's Mr. Townsend. He's taken a fall from the north pasture fence line. His horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him. He's conscious and talking, but his leg's not right, and Doc Morris is out at the Henderson place, and I didn't know where else to come first." Grace had her hat on and her bag of practical supplies, the one she kept stocked because a boarding house proprietress in a frontier town was wise to have basic medical equipment, in her hand before Cooper finished the sentence. "Let's go," she said. The ranch was 20 minutes at a trot, and Grace rode beside Cooper without wasting words on reassurance. When they reached the north pasture, she found Jasper sitting against the fence line with Walt beside him, and his face the controlled gray-white of a man maintaining composure through significant pain. His right leg was extended in front of him at an angle that was wrong. She knelt beside him. "Grace," he said, and his voice was steady, which impressed her because she had seen men with lesser injuries hollering like the world was ending. "How long ago?" she asked Walt. "About an hour," Walt said. "He wouldn't let us move him without someone who knew what they were doing." "Wise," Grace said. She ran her hands along the leg with the careful confidence of a woman who had learned basic field medicine out of practical necessity. "I don't think it's broken," she said. "I think it may be a severe sprain and possibly a small fracture lower in the bone. You need the doctor." "The doc will be back by evening," Cooper said. "Then we get you off this ground and into the house and the doc comes to you," Grace said. Jasper looked at her with a slight flicker of something, a contained kind of gratitude that was specifically for her being there and being practical rather than panicked, and said, "I'm heavier than I look." "I don't intend to carry you," Grace said. "I intend to supervise the process of getting you onto that board Walt is going to get from the barn, and then into the house, and then onto a flat surface where you will stay until the doctor arrives and confirms what I already suspect." "All right," Jasper said. They managed the process. It was awkward and painful, she could see it in the set of his jaw, but he bore it without drama, and she directed Walt and Cooper with the precise calm of someone who had a plan. Inside the main ranch house, which was spare and clean and smelled of cedar and wood smoke, they got him onto the bedroom floor. The bed was too soft, she determined, for a limb injury, and she elevated the leg and packed it in cool, wet cloths from the pump water and told Cooper to go and find the doctor. She sat with Jasper while they waited. The ranch house was quiet, the afternoon sun barred across the wooden floor. His face had come back to its normal color now that the leg was elevated and the immediate ordeal of moving was over. "Thank you," he said. "Of course," she said. She was checking the elevation, making sure the cloths were doing their job. "You didn't panic," he said. "I very rarely panic," she said. "I find it inefficient." He made a sound that was clearly a laugh, then winced because laughing engaged muscles he was currently regretting. "Don't laugh," she said. "No," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to think of a graceful moment to tell you something," he said, "and I've been waiting for the right time, which is apparently not a skill I have because the right time appears to keep not arriving." Grace looked at him. "I love you," he said. "I am aware this is an awkward setting and a poor delivery, but I thought it was better to say it badly than to keep not saying it." She looked at him for a long moment on the floor of his own ranch house, his injured leg elevated on a rolled blanket, his face earnest and completely without artifice. "It is not a poor delivery," she said quietly. "A poor delivery would have been saying it in a crowded room or on the street or after 3 glasses of whiskey. You said it alone and plainly and you meant it. That is not poor delivery." "Grace," he said. "I love you too," she said. "I have been aware of it for some time, and I have been deciding how to say it, which means we have both been terrible at this." He reached out his hand, and she took it, and they sat like that in the quiet afternoon while his leg was elevated and the doctor was on his way. And the life that was going to be theirs was very close now, practically visible. Dr. Morris arrived at dusk and confirmed Grace's assessment. A moderate fracture of the smaller lower bone, plus a significant sprain that would require 6 weeks of careful rest and limited weight bearing. He splinted the leg with competent efficiency, and told Jasper he was fortunate in what he didn't break, and told Grace she had done exactly the right things with the elevation and the cold cloths, and left a packet of willow bark compound for the pain. Jasper was going to be off the leg for 6 weeks. Grace went back to the boarding house that evening with a particular purpose settled in her mind. She arrived at Cooper's boarding situation. He rented a room from old Percy Watts and told him that for the next 6 weeks she was going to be at the ranch every other morning to help manage the household operations, and that Cooper and Walt and Rodolfo would need to manage the ranch work itself, which they were entirely capable of doing. Cooper looked at her with an expression of profound relief and something that looked very much like wondering delight, as though a practical angel had appeared and solved a problem he hadn't quite known how to solve. For the next 6 weeks, Grace managed. She managed her boarding house, and she managed Jasper's ranch household with the organizational confidence of a woman who had been running a commercial establishment for 2 years, and she did it without either of them making it strained or complicated. She cooked because cooking for a man who could not stand on his leg was practical, not romantic. She read to him from the books on his shelf when the evenings were long, and the pain in his leg made sleep difficult, which she discovered was more pleasant than any conversation, because his responses to what she read were full of the texture of his mind at its most unguarded. She played cards with him because boredom, as she observed, was making him difficult, and he was a formidable card player who was clearly accustomed to winning, and who took an almost boyish pleasure in competing with someone who could actually challenge him. They also argued, which was new, and which turned out to be one of the more informative developments of the whole period. They argued about the proper management of a financial account. Grace thought he was too casual about tracking individual expenditures. He thought her system was more elaborate than necessary. And it was a genuine disagreement, not a polite exchange, and it ended with them having worked out a compromise system that incorporated both of their instincts. Afterward, Grace felt, with some surprise, that she had enjoyed the argument. She was not sure she had ever enjoyed an argument before. She thought it was because he argued fairly, not to win, but to work out the truth of the matter, and the same quality of honest engagement that she valued in his conversation was present in his disagreement. She was washing dishes in his kitchen at the end of one of these long days in September when he came in on his crutch. The doctor had cleared him for crutch mobility at the 4-week mark and leaned against the doorframe and looked at her in the particular way that she had come to know, the warm and certain regard that she had learned to receive without deflecting it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said, drying a pot. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement, a steady middle tone that was exactly him. She set down the pot. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway of his own kitchen with his crutch and his patient face, and she looked at him and felt the whole architecture of the last months. The fire, the lumber, the Abilene Road, the chicken pie, the Sunday afternoons, his hand reaching for hers on the ranch house floor, and it was all of one piece, all pointing in the same direction, and she was a woman who knew how to read a map. "Yes," she said, "I will." He crossed the kitchen in 3 crutch-assisted strides and kissed her, which was the first time he had kissed her, and it was careful and certain and warm. And when she pulled back, she was smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in a very long time, not the controlled, competent smile of a woman managing a situation, but something more open and more real. "We should tell Mabel Holt," she said. "God help us," he said. "She'll be delighted," Grace said. "She'll also be insufferable about it for approximately 6 months, but that's a small price." He laughed, a full, unconstricted laugh this time because his leg was healing well, and she felt it in her own chest like an echo. They were married in October of 1881 at the Callow Creek Methodist Church, on a Saturday with a clear blue sky and a light wind off the north that carried the smell of coming winter. Mabel Holt had been, as predicted, both delighted and insufferable, and had organized the entire reception with the focused energy of a woman, given an outlet for her considerable management abilities. The Reverend performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Rodolfo stood as Jasper's witness, and Grace's friend Ruth Callie, who ran the seamstress shop on Main Street, and was one of the few women in Callow Creek who had consistently treated Grace as a complete person rather than a category, stood as Grace's witness. Grace wore a dress she and Ruth had made together, a clean, elegant deep blue that was not a wedding gown in the traditional sense, but was beautiful in a precise and honest way that suited her. She had her dark hair up and she walked down the aisle of that small church with the calm confidence of a woman who was walking towards something she was certain of. And when she reached Jasper at the front and looked at him tall and steady in his best clothes, his leg fully healed, his face doing that thing it did when he was moved and was choosing to be present in it rather than managing it, she felt the fullness of the moment like weather, like the sky before rain. "You look," he said when she reached him and then stopped. "Don't cry," she said quietly because his eyes had gone bright. "I'm not going to cry," he said. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." They were both lying, a little, and both knew it. The Reverend began. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was the first winter they spent as man and wife, and it was one of the better winters of Grace's life. Not because it was without difficulty, because frontier winters were never without difficulty, but because the difficulties were shared, which made them a different kind of thing entirely. The boarding house was Jasper's as much as hers now in the practical sense, and he helped run it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, though the management of it remained entirely Grace's territory, and he knew it and respected it. The ranch was his project, and she participated in its operations with increasing knowledge and genuine interest. In February, Grace discovered she was expecting. She had been fairly certain for a week before she went to see Dr. Morris, and she was entirely certain before he confirmed it, because she was a woman who paid close attention to her own body. She sat with the information quietly for a day before telling Jasper, not because she had doubts about his response, but because she wanted the knowledge to herself for one small period, to be alone with the astonishing fact of it before it became shared. She told him on a Sunday evening, sitting by the parlor fire at the boarding house. She said it simply because simple was the right register for something this large. He was quiet for a breath, and then he reached over and took her hand and held it, and his grip was warm and steady and slightly stronger than usual, the way a grip gets when someone is feeling something that has no immediate outlet. "Are you all right?" he asked. "In terms of health, I mean." "I'm quite well," she said. "The doctor says everything appears normal." He was quiet again, and she could feel him sitting with it, making room for it. "I am the happiest man in Callow Creek," he said finally, very quietly, as though he was stating it for the record. "That seems like a reasonable assessment," Grace said, and squeezed his hand. The pregnancy progressed through spring and into the summer of 1882 without serious complication, which Grace attributed to the fact that she was constitutionally healthy and had spent 2 years in active physical labor. She reduced the heavier work as the summer advanced and managed the boarding house from a more administrative stance, which Jasper facilitated by taking on some of the physical tasks she would ordinarily have handled herself, and which she allowed without much argument because she had learned, in the months of their marriage, that accepting his help was not a concession to dependence. It was simply what you did when someone who loved you wanted to contribute. The town of Callow Creek had its opinions about the pregnancy, of course, as it had opinions about everything. Mabel Holt became even more attentive, which was both touching and occasionally overwhelming, and Mrs. Whitfield at the restaurant started saving Grace the most comfortable chair. Even Aldous Fitch at the bank, who Grace had never forgiven for the loan refusal and never would, managed a stiff congratulations on the street one day that she received without warmth but with ordinary politeness, because she was not a person who held grudges past the point of usefulness. The summer also brought a development at the ranch that required significant attention, a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Burl Caddock, who claimed that Jasper's eastern fence line encroached on what he considered his grazing land. Caddock was a large, loud man with a habit of solving boundary disagreements through volume and implied threat, and when he came to the ranch on a July afternoon with 2 of his hands and a face full of indignation, Grace happened to be there. She watched Jasper handle it with the calm precision that was characteristic of him. He had the survey documentation, which he produced without drama, and he explained the legal boundary with the factual patience of a man who had done his research and had no need to be agitated about it. Caddock blustered. Jasper waited out the blustering and then simply repeated the legal facts. Caddock made what might have been construed as a veiled threat about the kinds of troubles that could find a man's fence line on a dark night. Jasper looked at him steadily and said, "If my fence line suffers any accidental damage, I have the documents to rebuild it on the correct legal boundary and the documentation to take the matter to the county court. I'd prefer not to do that, and I suspect you'd prefer the same. Is there anything else we need to discuss?" Caddock went. The fence line was never touched. Grace told him afterward that she had been watching and had been entirely ready to contribute to the conversation if required. "I know," he said. "I could feel you calculating your intervention the whole time." "You were doing fine," she said. "But it helped," he said, "knowing you were there." She understood this because she felt the same thing, that his presence in her orbit made certain things easier, not because he did them for her, but because being known and supported by someone gave you a particular kind of groundedness. Their son was born on the 10th of September, 1882, in the bedroom of the boarding house, with Dr. Morris and Mabel Holt in attendance. The birth was hard. Grace had not expected it to be otherwise, having realistic views on the matter, and it went on for 11 hours. And Jasper sat in the hall for all 11 of those hours and could be heard by Dr. Morris periodically asking careful questions through the closed door, which the doctor answered with patient economy. The boy was healthy and strong and had dark hair from both his parents and his father's particular quality of attention in his eyes from the very beginning, which Grace remarked on within the first hour of his life. "He looks at things," she said. "He's already looking at things." Jasper was sitting beside her on the edge of the bed, holding the child with the careful intensity of a man fully aware of the weight and significance of what he was holding. "What do you want to call him?" he asked. They had discussed names but had not settled, and now that the boy was real and present and looking at things with those alert dark eyes, Grace thought about it properly. "Thomas," she said, which was her first husband's name, "if you don't mind. And James was my father's name." Jasper looked at her. There was something very clear and very good in his expression. "Thomas James Townsend," he said. "Yes," Grace said. He kissed her temple with the particular gentleness of a man whose emotion was larger than his usual capacity for expression, and held his son, and Grace leaned against his shoulder, and outside the September light was the soft gold of late summer going to autumn, and Callow Creek went on about its ordinary business beyond the window. Mabel Holt came in 20 minutes later to check on them and found this domestic scene, and immediately began to cry with the productive enthusiasm she brought to strong feeling, which made Cooper, who was waiting downstairs because he had shown up without being asked, purely on the basis of caring about the Townsends, come to the bottom of the stairs and call up anxiously to ask if everything was all right. "Everything is perfectly fine," Grace called back down, in the steady voice that was entirely hers. "Tell Cooper the baby is healthy, and his name is Thomas." Cooper made a sound from the bottom of the stairs that strongly suggested he was going to need a moment. The years that followed were full years of work and growth, and the small, specific joys that accumulate when two people build a life with intention and honesty. Thomas grew, and was, as Grace had predicted from those first alert infant hours, a child who paid attention to animals, to how things worked, to the quality of the sky at different times of day, which was his father's habit surfacing in a new generation. He walked early and spoke early and was fearless about the outdoors in a way that kept both his parents intermittently anxious and consistently delighted. The boarding house continued to operate and continued to grow in reputation. By 1883, Grace had a waiting list for rooms on peak travel weeks, and by 1884, she had expanded the establishment by one further room and a proper dining facility that served supper to guests, and on certain evenings, to townspeople who wanted a decent meal in comfortable surroundings. She hired 2 women to help her with the cooking and housekeeping: Dorothy, who was steady and reliable and an excellent pie maker, and Clara, who was younger and quick, and had an instinct for hospitality that Grace recognized as a genuine gift. Jasper's ranch expanded too, in the careful, well-managed way of a man who understood what he was doing and did not overreach. He added a second pasture rotation that significantly improved the quality of his cattle, and he took on 2 additional permanent hands, and built a proper barn that Walt and Rodolfo had a significant hand in constructing, and which was, according to the architectural standards of Callow Creek, an unusually fine piece of work. On a Saturday morning in the spring of 1884, Grace sat at the front desk of the boarding house, going through the account books while Thomas, who was a year and a half old, sat on the floor beside her engaged in a serious examination of a wooden horse that Rodolfo had carved for him as a gift. The boarding house was quiet between guests, and the morning light came in the parlor windows in long, warm bands. Jasper came in from outside, where he had been checking the condition of the porch railing, which he repaired periodically as a matter of course. He stopped in the parlor doorway and looked at Grace at her desk with her account books and her careful figures, and Thomas on the floor with his wooden horse, the morning light on both of them, and his expression was the one she knew best of all his expressions. It was the quiet, complete one, the one that said, "This is what I was building toward, and it is real." She looked up from the account book and saw it as she always did. "The railing's fine," he said. "I replaced 2 boards." "Thank you," she said. He came in and crouched down by Thomas, who immediately offered him the wooden horse with the generous directness of small children. Jasper examined the horse with appropriate gravity and handed it back. Thomas regarded his father with the focused attention that was clearly inherited, and then returned to his examination. "I was thinking about the East Room," Grace said, returning to her accounts. "If we added another window opening on the east wall, it would improve the light considerably, and I think I could charge another $2 a week for it." "On which room?" Jasper asked, standing up. "The corner room, the one that faces the alley. If we take out the section of wall above the washstand, it would work," he said, thinking about it. "I'll look at it this afternoon." "You don't have to, I want to," he said. "I like having a reason to use Walt's framing square." She shook her head, smiling at her account book. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "You're just—" She looked up at him, this man she had married, this man who had shown up with lumber, exactly who you are. He looked at her for a moment, and the warmth between them was old and familiar and completely undiminished. "As are you," he said. Thomas, on the floor, held up his wooden horse for no particular reason and said "duh," which was a word he deployed with some indiscrimination, but which always made Jasper's face do something quietly extraordinary. "Yes," Jasper said, looking at his son. "I see the horse." The summer of 1884 brought a traveling exhibition through Callow Creek, a natural history collection that was making a circuit of the frontier towns, and which set up in the large barn on the edge of town for 2 days. Grace and Jasper took Thomas, who was by then just past his 2nd birthday and fully capable of walking on his own with great determination and limited judgment regarding direction. The exhibition had specimens of Texas wildlife preserved, displayed behind glass and geological samples from various formations across the state, and several large paintings of the landscape that were quite competent if not exceptional. Thomas stood in front of a painting of the open range at sunset for approximately 4 minutes without moving, which was an extraordinary duration for a 2-year-old, and both his parents stood behind him and watched him look at it. "He's going to be an artist," Grace said quietly. "He's going to be a scientist," Jasper said equally quietly. "He can be both," Grace said. "Yes," Jasper agreed. "He can be whatever he works to be." She took his hand there in the middle of the traveling exhibition in the barn on the edge of Callow Creek and held it, and he held hers back, and Thomas continued to look at the painting of the open range with his small, serious face. In the autumn of 1884, Grace found she was expecting again. This time she told Jasper the same evening she was certain, because she had learned that holding information alone was not always necessary when there was someone trustworthy to hold it with. He received it with the same warm, steady joy he had received the first time, and held her for a long, quiet moment in the kitchen of the boarding house. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said. "Good, actually. Better than the first time so far." "I'm glad," he said. And then, with the practical attentiveness that was so characteristic of him, "I'm going to build the shelf in the upstairs storage room this week, so it doesn't become one of those things that doesn't get done before there's suddenly no time." "That is an extremely romantic response," Grace said. "You like practical things," he said. "I do," she admitted. He built the shelf. Their second child, a boy again, arrived in the early summer of 1885 and was named Henry after no particular person, but because it was a name that suited him from the moment he arrived, loud and full of a very specific kind of energy that made Dr. Morris smile and Mabel Holt exclaim, and Cooper, who was by now a fixture of the family's extended circle, lean in the doorway of the room with an expression of pure delight and say, "That one's going to keep you busy." He was not wrong. Henry was a different child from Thomas, less contemplative, more kinetic, possessed of a laugh that was so outsized for his small person that it startled people who heard it for the first time. He was fearless in a way that was both joyful and taxing, and Grace managed him with the same practical confidence she brought to everything. And Jasper could be observed on any given evening sitting on the porch with Henry on his knee, making the particular face of a man who is both genuinely entertained by his child and aware that he is going to be very tired before this child is grown. Thomas, for his part, was a devoted if occasionally perplexed older brother, and could often be found attempting to explain the properties of rocks or the behavior of birds to Henry, who was not yet old enough for such explanations, but who sat through them, with a patience that seemed to exist solely in relation to his brother. The boarding house turned 5 years old in the summer of 1886, 5 years since the rebuilding, and Grace marked the occasion privately with a particular satisfaction that had nothing to do with the anniversary itself, and everything to do with the body of work it represented, the work of her hands and her mind and her will, which had taken something lost and made it into something better. Jasper found her in the parlor after the evening guests had retired, sitting in the good chair by the window where the light was best. "What are you thinking?" he asked, sitting down across from her. "About how different this room is from the one I lost," she said, "and how I'm glad for the difference." "If the fire hadn't happened," he began. "I know," she said. "You wouldn't have shown up with lumber, and we might never have." She tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the whole improbable architecture of it. "Funny the way things work," he said. "Not funny," she said. "Just the way things work." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and touched her face, his hand warm and work-rough and completely familiar to her, and she leaned into it for a moment, eyes closed. Thomas came down the stairs at that point, as Thomas periodically did in the evenings when he couldn't sleep, a habit both his parents recognized as his father's tendency to think past the hour when rest was sensible. He appeared in the parlor doorway in his nightshirt with his dark hair disordered, looking at them with the 4-year-old's clear-eyed observation. "Papa," he said. "Yes," Jasper said. "Is it night time?" "Yes," Jasper said. "It is quite solidly night time." "Oh," Thomas said, and appeared to consider this. "I was thinking about the hawk we saw today." "Tell me about it tomorrow," Jasper said, "when it is daytime and your mother and I have had some sleep." "All right," Thomas said, apparently satisfied by this arrangement. He looked at Grace. "Good night, Mama." "Good night, my love," Grace said. He went back upstairs with the philosophical acceptance of a child who was, in the end, reasonable. They heard his small feet on the stairs, and then the silence of a house in which everyone was where they were supposed to be. Grace looked at Jasper in the lamplight of the parlor she had built, in the boarding house she had rebuilt from ash, in the town that had seen her at her lowest and her best. "I love you," she said, because it was true and because she said it when it was true and for no other reason. "I love you," he said back, in the same steady way he said everything, as though it were the simplest and most obvious fact in the world, which it was. Outside, Callow Creek was quiet under the summer stars, and the night was warm, and somewhere on the North Road the wind moved through the mesquite in that particular way. It moved through the mesquite on still nights when everything was at rest. The boarding house stood solid and new and full of light, better than the first, because she had learned from the first, because out of the ash of the first someone had shown up not with condolences but with lumber, and the lumber had become walls, and the walls had become rooms, and the rooms had become a life, and the life was this. 2 boys asleep upstairs, and a good man across a table, and the lamp burning between them, and everything that mattered exactly where it belonged. In the years that followed, and there were many of them, full and various and sometimes difficult and always, in their way, good Grace Bishop Townsend would look back at the morning after the fire with the particular clarity that comes when you can see an event in its full context. She would remember the assembled town with their hats and their sympathy and their bread. She would remember the feeling of suffocating under the weight of everyone's pity. And then she would remember the sound of different boots, deliberate, unhurried, and the voice that had not said "I'm sorry," and the eyes that had gone straight to the chimney, and the words "you have something to build from," and the wagon full of lumber that arrived the next morning before 7. She would remember all of this, and she would feel, not gratitude exactly, but something larger than gratitude. The recognition that the single most important thing in a crisis was not sympathy, however genuinely offered, but someone who showed up with what you actually needed and believed you were capable of building something from it. Jasper Townsend had believed she was capable from the first moment he looked at her ruined property, and he had gone on believing it through every year of their life together. Through the rebuilding and the bank refusals and the pregnancy and the difficult nights and the neighbor disputes and the ordinary tiresome, wearing demands of keeping a life functioning on the frontier. He had never stopped believing it, and Grace had never stopped being worth believing in. And the combination of those two facts was the whole story, really, if you needed to reduce it to its essential components. But Grace, being a woman who valued precision, would have added one important detail. She had believed in him equally from the beginning in her clear-eyed and unflinching way. She had believed he was a man of genuine quality when there was no particular reward in believing it, and she had loved him before she fully knew she did, and she had built something with him that was better than anything either of them could have built alone. Which was, she thought, on a quiet October morning in 1887, with 3-year-old Henry asleep upstairs and Thomas on the porch watching the morning birds with a patience beyond his years, and Jasper visible from the parlor window checking the fence line along the boarding house garden with his methodical early morning attention. Which was, she thought, the whole point of it. Not to need no one, but to find the one person worth needing, and to be worth needing back, and to build and keep building, until what you had was something that could stand any kind of weather. She turned back to her account books, and the sun came fully up over Callow Creek, and the day opened, and it was good.